History Now with the old history man, Tom. That's me.
Welcome. This vlog is going to be about, history. A subject that I've studied and enjoyed my whole life. But why do it now? Well, this year has had two horrendous events that have stirred me out of my lethargy. The first one is I turned 75 years old.
You're 75 years old, you're 75 years old today.
Anyhow, I now realize I have a lot of history of my own, and I'd kind of like to share it with people while I still can. And the second horrible event is this annus horribilis, this insane time of 2020.
2020.
2020. I'm going to try to make some sort of sense out of this year. I don't know if I can. I'd like to kind of give it some context, but this year is so unique, I really have nothing to compare it to. But I'll try. And if it turns out just to be a coup-demic against President Trump and his deplorable followers, then that's where it will lead us. When I talk to most people about history, their eyes kind of glaze over and lose focus. And no, it's not about me and my personality. I can almost see their heads filling with all these dates and times and people and places and things and kings and presidents and wars and invasions and inventions, revolutions. Their mind just becomes this mystified, muddled mess. And they start to back away from me, back away from history. And this is true of teachers and students alike. Luckily, people probably watching this actually are going to like history. I'm interested in all of history, all of human history, everywhere, at any time, even back into the prehistoric times. But I intend to be more specific. Now, when you study anything in history, you have two needs. One is a subject, what it is that you're going to study, and secondly, you're going to need a time frame. When are you going to be studying this subject? For me, I'm going to have two subjects. The first one is going to be the birth and development of the United States of America, my country, your country maybe. And secondly, I'm going to study my own personal history, my 75 years on planet Earth. So we have the what's, and now we just have to kind of be more specific about the when's. In American history, when do we start the study? Do we start in 1787 with the U.S. Constitution, 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, or even back to 1492 when Chris Columbus arrived in the what is referred to as the New World? I'm going to start at 1607 with the founding of the first permanent English colony in America at Jamestown in Virginia. And then I'm also going to move up 600 miles to the north and take a look at the Massachusetts colonies of the Pilgrims that arrived in 1620, and then the much more numerous and better organized Puritans that started arriving in numbers in 1630. Now, I selected the English colonies because, well, America is basically an offshoot of England, of Britain. And a lot of our ideas, our political systems, our language, our philosophies really came from England and Scotland primarily. And that's really what our country developed from. So I'm not really going to start with 1565 when the Spanish founded St. Augustine in Florida. or any other of the European colonies. Well, in passing, I'll mention them. As the history goes on, I will talk about Canada and Mexico as events come to pass, and I will certainly talk about the natives that were here, the native tribes that were here when the English colonies began. The first colony, the Virginia colony, was started as a commercial enterprise right from day one. They began and intended to make money. This was a stock company, and some salespeople actually managed to sell the project and got funding, stockholders who intended to share in the wealth. I have no idea how they thought this was going to happen, but enough people believed in it that it got funded, and the ships were paid for, and the people were shipped over. Now, they had some strange ideas, to tell you the truth, and that's part of what history is about, is kind of trying to imagine yourself in those situations. And it was kind of amazing that these people showed up and basically came up to the 10,000 Indians or so who lived in the area and said, "Hey, this land now belongs to the King of England, and he gave us the property around here, and we're going to take it over, and on top of that, we're going to collect back rent from you." Of the 104 settlers that came, about half of them were gentlemen, people who did not labor and had really no intention of laboring. They came for much more for gold and silver that they thought they were going to find, and not worried very much about growing food. And this didn't turn out very well for the early settlers. And this was kind of an offshoot of the whole Western European development that was based on the fact that all these countries developed ocean-going ships, starting with the Portuguese, who explored the coast of Africa and eventually rounded the continent and got to India and the great wealth there. The Spanish crossed the Atlantic, of course, and found great wealth in Mexico and Peru, bringing back untold wealth. The Dutch themselves had come over and founded New Amsterdam and explored all around the world, eventually finding the Spice Islands, the Indonesian islands, and tapping into yet more wealth from the spice trade. And the English were kind of late to the game. They really spent more time robbing and harassing the Spanish treasure fleets coming over than in any thought of founding a colony. But after they defeated the Spanish Armada, peace started to develop between Spain and England, and it was kind of ruled to quit being pirates against the Spanish, and hey, let's join in on the colonies. And the Virginia colony was the first of that group. Further north in Massachusetts, although it was funded and there were stockholders and debts involved with it, they really came over more because of religion, and they brought their families with them. The idea of religious freedom was not the thought that we have of religious freedom, that everyone should be allowed to worship as they want. Their idea was that their form of worship was better than others, and they were being impinged upon back in the old world, and so they came over to the New World to kind of found a New Jerusalem, a great beautiful city on the hill that would inspire and lead all of humankind into the future. So being an earnest moral zealot while also looking to make some money were American traits that went back to the earliest days and continue down to this present time. In fact, in 1635, my earliest ancestors to come to America arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Area, coming over from Cambridgeshire, England. And they were probably Puritans, and they lived for 2 generations in the Puritan areas until they finally left and headed out into the backwoods areas of Virginia, kind of planting my deplorable hillbilly roots there and eventually migrating further into the Midwest. But whatever the motivations of the people coming to America, we have to look at their courage just to make the trip. The Virginia colonists took 4 months to get to America. The Pilgrims and the Puritans took about 2.5 months. And these were on pretty small ships. One of the Virginia ships was only 36 feet long. And they spent 4 months with 20 odd people in that cramped little area. That'd be enough to drive you nuts, drive you to extremes. And I'm kind of aware of that because I spent a few days on a 40-foot boat sailing on Lake Michigan once with 4 other people. And it became so intense and so crazy that we were forced to drink to excess more than a couple of times. Ooh. Anyhow, with my own personal history, it should be kind of easy to start with my date of birth. But what about my gestation period? It was a very different world outside while I was developing and growing inside my mother. At that time, World War II still raged. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our only 4-term president, still lived and ruled, at least for a bit more. Mussolini and Hitler still were alive, at least for a bit. There were no atomic bombs in the world, and then suddenly there were. And the last great mass casualties in the war were the poor civilians. And then it was over. The war ended, and a few weeks later, I arrived on the scene. Yay! I'm going to start my history with my birth and ignore the excitement around me while I was inside. So we're going to have to leave this horrible year of 2020. This time of massive mass madness. It's like living in a horrible, eerie, abysmal, absurd episode of The Twilight Zone. If history is still allowed in the American future, I wonder what historians in, say, 2060 will think about this present year. Will they look upon it like the tulip mania of Holland back in the 1630s, when tulips were brand new to Western Europe and became a fad, just madness reigned, and soon quite large fortunes were passing hands just to buy one from a tulip bulb? Or will they look upon it as the stock market mania of the roaring 20s, the 1920s, when just about everybody was buying stock and getting rich, at least on paper. And then it all came tumbling down, ruining lives, destroying the economy, and leading right into a Great Depression. Or will historians view it like the French Revolution, where vicious, sanctimonious mobs and aggressive politicians attacked, devastated, and destroyed their society, and then created a new utopia based upon their wonderful ideas. Ideas that still plague us down to this day. Good luck to us all, but think tulips. Before we start going any further, really have to ask the question, why would anybody be interested in this old man's story? Why would you? Why would anybody? Well, I'll plead my case. I'm a 75-year-old orphan. And that should tug some heartstrings in the audience. although to be honest, most 75-year-old people have become orphans. But I have lived 75 long years. I don't know how I did it. I guess just staying alive, staying alive. But I have experienced quite a bit down the years. I remember quiet times before leaf blowers and car alarms. I remember much more relaxed and calmer times before cell phones and computers, before Facebook or Twitter. I remember where I was when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I watched live, in real time, when the first man walked on the moon, when LBJ announced on television he wasn't going to run for re-election, and I watched Nixon resign. So I've had some interesting times, interesting history that I could relate, but I also had some wild times. And I lived the 60s. I went from being a crew-cut altar boy high school prom king in 1962 to being a long-haired hippie musician in 1967. A lot of things were happening in those days. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll were an important part of my life for a while. And so were French and fun and philosophy and protest and music and humor and love. Exciting times. And the music, of course. Oh, the music. I watched the Beatles and the Stones live.
She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride, and she don't care.
I watched Jimi Hendrix, The Animals, Joe Cocker, and many, 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 many more. I was a bit of a rock star myself. During the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I toiled in radio and television, in music, movies, and comedy. I was present when George Carlin was arrested for his 7 naughty words. I helped organize the first Earth Day 50 years ago. I pissed against the Great Wall of China. I made a comedy album before Monty Python did. And Mel Gibson took me to lunch. So I had some interesting times to tell about. I got some music and video to share, so stay tuned. Now let's leave this horrible time and let's go back. Back. I have a long way to go. Gotta go faster than this. That's better. What? Back. Back. Keep going back. 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 Way back. Not that far back. 1945. Born 75 years ago.
Happy birthday to you.
I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, the Show Me state, and spent my first 8 years there, probably the most formative years in any life. So I was a doubting Thomas born in the Show Me state, so it's not unexpected that I turned out to be quite skeptical. I was also born exactly 9 months after my father's birthday, and I often think that I was a present from my mother and from the gods, I suppose, to my father. I hope he wasn't too disappointed by the present. I've had a lucky life, not winning the lottery lucky or being born into great wealth, but lucky in a more basic, important ways, I think. Lucky in friendships, lucky in love, lucky never to have gone to jail, lucky at my age just to be alive, and lucky still to have my mind and my hair. Well, anyhow, I haven't cut this since the demic began. I hope it doesn't get down to my waist by the time it ends. But most of all, I was lucky to be born into my family. The earliest days, my incredible intelligence and my great athleticism obviously became manifest. And within a very short time, you could see my independent thinking and my ability to go set my own path and follow it. We were, I suppose, middle class, although I didn't even think about or know about such terms for many years yet. We rented the downstairs of a brick duplex, but what I remember mostly about those 8 years was just the sheer joy of being a kid then. It was a time when you didn't need expensive toys or these video games to have a great life. You just go outside and play and play and play. Basically, you spent every possible hour outside playing, using your imagination, and having just a great time. If you happen to have a few cents in your pocket, you could actually treat yourself. Penny candy cost a penny. Comic books and candy bars cost 5 cents. Sodas a dime. You could go to a movie matinee for 15 cents. These price rises have been very significant over the course of my life. If not in jeans and a cowboy hat with my trusty revolver stuck in my belt, I was probably walking around with a baseball glove and ball and bat. I love baseball. I remember spending summer evenings laying on the cot out on the screened-in back porch listening to Harry Carey announce St. Louis Cardinal games while my eyes slowly got heavier and fell asleep, hopefully with the Cardinals ahead. Now, the first game I ever actually attended was a Philadelphia Athletics versus the St. Louis Browns game. That's how old I am. It was an exciting game. The hometown Browns won it with a walk-off home run in the bottom of the ninth. No wonder I loved baseball. And if someone had told me back in those days what baseball would do to itself in this horrible year, I would never have believed it. Never believed it. They'd never done anything even slightly like it any time during the 143-year history. Not during the 2 world wars, not during the great Spanish flu epidemic, not during the worst of the Depression years, but for this little feeble disease, they embarrassed themselves. They took a knee and then they played in empty stadiums while wearing masks. Well, back home, my older brother, who's about 7 years older than I was always a great pal, and he put up with me, still does. He even used to, I think, happily take me along when he'd be hanging out with his pals, school and after school. How embarrassing it must have been. My younger sister, about 2 years younger than me, has always been fun and a load of laughs. I also found at an early age that I liked being alone. I enjoyed my own company. I learned to read at an early age. Well, maybe not that early, and I soon developed a love of reading. I still have it and can still happily read for hours at a time. And I also developed my imagination. I created imaginary adventures, had discussions, probably an early podcast in my head. I also remember when we got our first television, an amazing 10-inch screen that we'd all sit around and watch. I was allowed to watch some television. I did soon develop some fascinating heroes. Hopalong Cassidy, for instance, and Howdy Doody, Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. The Lone Ranger with the stirring William Tell overture sounding through it. The Cisco Kid, Amos and Andy, Superman. I remember it all vaguely but very, very fondly. Now let's return to our study of American history. When I was a kid going to school, it was taught as a shining story of a nearly perfect country bringing freedom and prosperity to the world. A moral, uplifting tale, a heroic story filled with virtuous presidents, honorable intentions, and heroic justified wars. I wasn't even out of high school yet, and I knew that this version of history was wildly inaccurate. I became a revisionist and started my search for real, true history. But something happened over the past 2 or 3 decades, I think, when American history was now flipped on its head, did a 180, and instead of being a hymn to the wonders of America, it has become a sordid tale, a rap song of degradation. It was now seen as a reprehensible tale of greed and corruption and horrible aggressive wars and genocide and massacres, and I can't really argue with all of that. I can't dismiss it out of hand. There's some truth in all of what is being taught. But added on to it, kind of ladled into it, are non-historic elements that seem to dominate. Things like systemic racism, sexism, oppression, white privilege, and capitalism-based poverty. These are all sins that have been added to our history, that have been found in our history, that seems to even be inherent in being American. So it's no wonder that all these statues are being torn down, that so many young people have been acting so ignobly, and my history is now looked upon with disgust. Anyhow, now let's return back to our events in early colonial America and see how wonderful those early years were for them, the early years of our 413-year history. And I'll give you a little hint. They weren't very wonderful at all. So, in the Virginia colony, some very dire days were happening. The gold and silver that they wanted so much did not appear, but hunger and disease and aggressive native warriors did. The colonists were attacked within days of their arrival, and this intermittent warfare continued for the next 40 years. Some trade was managed for needed food, but violence predominated. New colonists and supplies arrived regularly, but 90% of all of the colonists in those early years died. In 1611, the survivors were about to give up and sail back to England when a resupply fleet arrived. The first successful tobacco harvest happened in 1612, providing a much-needed cash crop to help the colony survive and slowly prosper. But warfare with the natives continued, with massacres being committed by both sides. In 1622, 347 colonists were slaughtered in one such massacre. That's about 30% of the entire colony's population wiped out. This warfare continued until a treaty was finally signed in 1646, and showing that the colonists were victorious. In 1619, Virginia held the first election in America, picking candidates for the Legislative Assembly, the House of Burgesses. The last of the mail-in votes were tabulated in 2014, and the initial results were overturned, and Virginia was turned blue. Anyhow, by 1650, the entire population of the English colonies came to about 50,000 people, with 18,500 or so of them in Virginia. Many of them were indentured servants, the first forced laborers in America, and they even came over on the very first ships arriving in the colony, and these indentured servants did most of the labor during the first years. In Massachusetts, the early colonists found empty native villages along the coast, which made it much safer for the first pilgrims and Puritans. There had been a terrible epidemic that swept through that area from 1617 to 1619, just prior to the arrival of the colonists, and this made it much easier to settle and secure the land. No such epidemic had swept through the Virginia areas, and I wonder if maybe the natives there were wearing face masks. Anyhow, by 1650, the total population of Massachusetts was about 16,500 people, with another 7,000 in what is now Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Maine. In Massachusetts, about 2,000 Puritans arrived at the colony every year during the 1630s, growing and strengthening the colony during these dangerous first years. They came over largely from England, fleeing the rising tensions and eventually the Civil War between religious dissidents and the king. And in fact, many of the Puritans in Massachusetts returned to England after the overthrow of the king and the triumph of the Puritans. In Massachusetts, the colonists came to live and work, to survive and thrive and pay off the debts incurred in the founding of the colony, and the Puritans always honored their debts. When they weren't praying, they were probably out farming, trading, and making money. Their first export crop was fish, and followed by lumber and furs. They also developed a successful shipbuilding industry. The first major military conflict in the Massachusetts colony was the Pequot War that ran from 1636 to 1638. And it was largely fought over trade. The Pequot tribe dominated the Connecticut River, which was the main trade route bringing goods from the Dutch in New Amsterdam, New York, up into the New England and even further up north into Canada for the trade goods, with trade going up and down through the Pequot area, which made them rich and powerful, and they dominated all the other tribes nearby, and the tribes weren't really happy about this state of affairs. The Massachusetts colony wanted to block that Dutch trade route and take it over themselves, and so they wanted to set up a trading post further up the Connecticut River than the Dutch had reached, and that's what really set off the conflict. And a lot of the local tribes joined the colonists to fight the Pequots, including the Mohawks, the Mohegans, the Narragansetts, and the Wampanoags. And ultimately, the Pequots lost. Maryland began as the third colony during these years, and by 1650 there were probably about 5,000 people in the Maryland colony. It was set up as a refuge for Catholics, and later on for the Roundheads, for the Royalists, the losers in the English Civil War, and also a place that afforded some religious freedom to other dissenters. Labor in the Chesapeake area and Virginia and Maryland colonies was always in short supply, and there were too many gentlemen in both these colonies to actually do any work. So they relied upon indentured servants. These were people who were either sentenced to or contracted for a certain time period of labor, usually 4 to 7 years. And they were usually used as farm laborers or domestic servants. At the end of their contracted time, they were supposed to be paid their wages and sometimes even land given to them. But probably more than 40% of all of these indentured servants died before their contract expired. Possibly the greatest moral and social mistake ever made in American history happened in 1619, when the first African slaves were unloaded into the Virginia colony. They were few in number and didn't come to outnumber the indentured servants until the early 1700s. And in fact, the first African slaves were treated as indentured and were freed and made freedmen at the end of their contracts. And this didn't change into lifetime chattel slavery for a few decades. But we still are suffering from the effects of the introduction of slavery 401 years ago. Now, I like to finish each show with a little takeaway, a little aspect of universal human history. And today I want to just say that life is change. Everything changes. Countries, societies, even beliefs change over the years, like humans themselves. Born small, we grow up, we grow out, we grow old, we grow weak, and then we die. And probably get listed as a COVID death. I suspect that many of the principles behind this demic really hate ordinary people, because they have managed to squeeze out all the joy of ordinary life. Bars are closed, sports is ruined, there's no concerts, no churches, no barbecues, no picnics, no gatherings at all allowed, no fun. But they especially seem to hate children, leading me to think that they must have suffered very joyless childhoods themselves, where they were mocked by other children due to their social ineptness, laughed at by girls, threatened by the popular. And now they are extracting a perverse vengeance upon children. Schools have been shut, sports stopped, pools and playgrounds closed, meetings of any kind of fun stopped for kids too. They've ruined the fun of Halloween, and now they have their sights set on Thanksgiving. A big chunk of precious childhood ruined by them. They must be severely ill, severely mentally ill, to have inflicted such pain upon children. Sick bastards. The mighty pontificators. They're eager propagandists. The sleazy pushing politicians. And the smug protectors. All enjoying turning our regular daily joys of life into a year of sheer fear. And abusing children while making wads of money. It's almost as if they aren't really Americans at all. Enough! That's enough for episode 1. Like, subscribe, and comment below. And check back soon for episode 2, where we'll be continuing our study of the history of America and of my 75 years. And in that episode, I'm going to be talking about colonialism and potty training. Sounds exciting, so don't miss any of History Now!